Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Tonight, my guest is Brian Nichols, who's the host of the Brian Nichols Show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Magdalene. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
So, I've interviewed quite a few libertarians recently. I've kind of been on a bit of a libertarian tear. But one of the things that I've wanted to talk about really is coalition building. And you seem to be doing that through a lot of your interviews. I've read some of the things you put out. So, first of all, how did you get involved in politics and move into an area where you wanted to bring different types of ideologies together?
Yeah, so I, much like you, when you were on my show, getting to learn your story, I grew up in a very political household. My dad was an elected official for 15 years, and I got the chance to really experience politics firsthand, from a local level,
Mhm.
obviously, but being able to meet a lot of the movers and shakers, a lot of the people we're familiar with nowadays, Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton, all these names in New York politics, and to be able to kind of experience that firsthand, it was you know it was exciting for me because number one, I was always excited about politics, but number two, you could actually see how things got accomplished.
Mhm.
And in my kind of brain, it looked as simple as it was. You were able to, vote in the best ideas and so forth. And that actually led to some positive change. And, I knew that there was politicians I didn't agree with. My family was more the GOP, and we didn't necessarily agree with the folks on the left, but it wasn't a matter of, not being able to have a discourse. And that
Right.
carried through as I went to college. I was the president of the College Republicans Club for a number of years, but that didn't mean I wasn't able to have a conversation with folks on the left. Actually, I was really good friends with the College Democrats president, and we would do different fundraisers together and such. So it's always been kind of my nature to have this civil conversation, this civil dialogue, which I think I kind of just naturally carried over as I found myself here in the greater libertarian movement. I drifted from the GOP more towards like the conservatarian, and I would say, I'm probably more leaning libertarian than I am conservative, but I definitely, find a lot of sympathies with the folks more on the right. So, but at the same point in time, I'm trying to build some bridges with some folks on the left where we have some key agreements on some very important issues.
Mhm.
So I think coalitions across the board super important, and that's how we actually get some things done.
And now that we have sort of seen the autopsy, at least on our level, of why the GOP lost in 2020, and really why Democrats lost so many seats in local levels, do you think that each party is stopping itself from expanding in growing coalitions? Because Democrats are often very angry at the Green Party for sucking away votes. I know Republicans take active measures to keep libertarians off ballots. So is it that they've become so isolated that other parties are not allowed in for a coalition building situation?
A lot of it's power, and this is one of the unfortunate realities that we grow up and we see. We see government often portrayed as this entity that can do good.
Mhm.
If you want to get something done in your, if you're trying to get some big accomplishment, you usually think, oh, how can we go about enacting this through government? Can we get the mayor on board? Stuff like
Right.
that. Those kind of questions. But what we find is, unfortunately, a lot of people in government, they're not there for the actual do good
Right.
stuff. They're more so there for accumulating power. And especially as you get up to the higher levels of government, being that in the federal government, you do see predominantly, that power structure even more so growing, and because there's more power consolidated in the federal government than there ever has been before. So,
Right.
at a local level, it's actually kind of more easy to build those coalitions because you can focus on local issues, things that kind of transcend left and right politics, that transcend the tribal politics that we see on a national level, and actually talk about things that matter to you, your family, your immediate circle of
Right.
influence, right? So if you're in an area where the garbage doesn't get picked up on time, make that the issue, make that a coalescing
Right.
issue, that you can find some common ground with people across the board, regardless of their political ideology. I think we're going to find, when we can start to agree with more people and build those bridges, that opens up the doors to having more conversations about some of those tougher conversations that we really haven't had in the past, because quite frankly, we were told we shouldn't be talking about those kind of things.
And we've seen that sort of shutdown of dialogue between the two sides. Really, I think within the last 5 years is really when it started to become suffocating on every level, on social media, in person, in family situations. And I've almost wondered now is, are we better off looking at having smaller parties like Libertarians, Greens, Independents? Are we better off having them try to build coalitions with corporations or with businesses? Do you see that as a way forward of trying to bring in a business aspect? Because I don't see the GOP or the Democrats acknowledging problems outside of just the economy and defense.
So let me make sure, I just want to make sure I'm answering your question right. So basically, do we see maybe a future where these smaller third parties are essentially kind of working hand in hand with these corporations in order to enact political goals?
Not even just that, but even local businesses, small business, to try to leverage the power of that to go up against Democrats or Republicans. So we get some more local issues brought up at town meetings or at local meetings for government.
Gotcha. I would think it might be not necessarily working with the businesses, but rather those individuals in those respective communities that, to your point, right, would actually be the business leaders, maybe. So, you take for example, let's use Bill. Bill, he leads a manufacturing company in his community. Bill's been there for 10, 15 years, and people know Bill. They do work with Bill. They trust Bill. They see Bill at their kids' football games. So Bill's around, but they also know that Bill happens to have, some different views than they do. Maybe he's a libertarian, for example, or maybe he's a conservative, right?
Right.
And they, instead of looking at him as Bill, the Republican, or Bill the Democrat, they see him as Bill, the person that they know from the community, Bill
Right.
who brings value to the community. So when Bill, if he decided to run for mayor or city council or name the local position on a certain issue, they're not going to look at him with the instant, that gut instinct of, this is the other, this is my tribal instinct. I have to get my defenses up. But instead, Bill can now reach people on different levels. And it's, again, going more towards, to your point, these issues that I think we're going to find are more easy to have conversations about because, quite frankly, they're impacting you directly in your life. And I don't think it's necessarily working hand in hand with parties, but rather using parties as a tool to really get these ideas into actual policy, because the policy is where really we're going to see some long lasting changes for the better, because policy is actually going to impact people's lives. Talking about this stuff, it's great to an extent,
Right.
but how far do we go, right? How far are we going to sit here and talk about doing this stuff all day long, and then it's
Right.
actually getting the stuff into action? That's why I'm a big fan of folks like Corey DeAngelis, at the Reason Foundation, focusing on school choice, not just talking about, but actually working with these state governments, getting actual school choice legislation into policy. That's a big deal, and that's impacting people right now who, quite frankly, didn't have the chance to send their kids to school over the past year because the schools didn't even make it as an option. So
Right.
I think we're seeing, as we're starting to answer the questions out there in the marketplace, that's where we're going to find the most long-term success, because as people are telling us what their problems are, and that they're going to tell us what the problems are, it's on us to be able to make sure we're solving those issues.
And with those issues, when we're starting to see what people are bringing up, I think it's sort of changing. It's not so much, of course, it's the economy is the overall issue, but I'm hearing things about infrastructure. I'm hearing things about mental health. I'm hearing things about education in a way that I haven't before, about what the electorate cares about. And it doesn't seem to me like going into 2022 or 24, those are issues either party is ready to even run on or to tackle or to understand the nuance of. So going into those next elections, how can libertarians expand their influence into the GOP? Because I honestly believe the GOP is in one of the worst conditions it's ever been in. And I don't think people are acknowledging it at the RNC.
Mm-hmm. I think focusing local is going to
Yeah.
be important to start. We're seeing it happen in states like New Hampshire with the Free State Project. We're seeing it happen in states like Tennessee. A good friend of the show, Kenny Cody, doing work down there in Cock County as the youngest GOP chair in Tennessee, but having the ability to influence folks in the greater GOP, decision making sector in Tennessee that otherwise he wouldn't be able to talk to. Oh, and Kenny happens to be leaning libertarian.
Right.
So I think that's going to be where we're going to find the most successes, because when we're going to be able to actually start to impact the real person, right? Your average mom and dad, the average person out there who's looking, quite frankly, for something, anything as an answer to their problems out there.
Right.
They're seeing, and we talked about this when you were on my show, is that there is a resounding understanding that something is wrong.
Right.
We get it, and we all feel it. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of now, what are we going to do about it? How can we best address it? And I think the way we're going to be able to best address it is starting to focus on the things that we can actually control. So we too often, and this is just the very nature of the human being, is that we want to focus on things that are big out there, but we instead of focusing on the things immediately in our circle of influence, things that we can touch, feel, and actually make decisions that will be impacted on, we focus on these big things out there, and we look for reasons to focus on those things, so we don't have to focus on the things that, quite frankly, are going to be difficult sometimes to do in our own personal lives, because then it requires a behavioral
Right.
change. So I think when we're going to see that we're making better changes for people directly, and they start to draw the line, the dots, the proverbial dots, and they're saying, okay, this is not just an idea, this is actually a solution that was presented by this idea or this person that brought this forward. That's where they're gonna start to say, okay, this is where we're gonna make some real long term, not just people who are going to look at us as people that they can trust for ideas in politics, but like this is going to be building the culture. Like that's the
Right.
big thing right now where we're having a lot of issues, is this long-term cultural direction. How are we going to be as a society to have conversations with people if we can't
Right.
just exist together? How can we and that's, I think, where the future is going to be focused on, is how we're going to be able to truly, I know the bumper sticker, coexist, right? But like in a non-ironic sense, how can we actually coexist here?
And with that, do you think, because in order to even examine what went wrong, you have to be able to talk to people, and you have
Mm.
to be able to have young people explain their positions. And I've wondered, do you think that the Republican brand has gotten too toxic? Is there too much associated with it now that it makes it difficult for young people to campaign for it or to push forward with it? And maybe it's the Libertarian brand. I know the Libertarian brand is obviously less toxic than the GOP brand.
Is it? I don't know if
I
it
think
is
I think
necessarily.
daily it might be. I think there's a little less hatred.
So yes and no. I think more so because libertarian people don't know about us.
Right.
If you were to say what's a libertarian, they'd say a what? A liberal terror? What? And I think the GOP, you actually have a very good point. This is actually one of the biggest concerns I had in 2015 with Trump. I said, and this is why I was a big Rand Paul fan. 2015, I said I look at Trump as someone who could seriously damage, destroy what does it mean to be a constitutionalist or a
Right.
conservative, or just tying those words by association, a Republican. Up to that point, I was still a registered, red Republican. I was all about it, rah rah team GOP. But then I realized, like, oh, this is really going to hurt the ability for us to have an articulate message. Now, granted, that was still on my libertarian journey. I was still the infancy stages, if you will. But it was, I think, more of a chance for me to kind of put things in context and seeing, oh, this has kind of happened before. We see
Right.
this. We saw it in '08 with Ron Paul versus John McCain. We saw it in 12 with Ron Paul versus Mitt Romney. We saw it here in 2015, 2016 with Trump taking on the GOP establishment, but also folks like Rand Paul, who we
Mhm.
thought would have a really good shot at being a libertarian alternative. And then going up here into 2020, I mean, it did come down to Trump versus Biden, but it wasn't anybody voting for Biden. It was people
No.
voting against Trump. And unfortunately, Trump did have that GOP label next to him. So it did hurt, I think, a lot of the brand. However, when you look at, and I just did an interview with Nick from Reason Magazine, literally just a little bit before we interviewed here today. And one of the things we were talking about is you look at what happened beyond just the top of the ticket. Congress, the Democrats won the Senate by just like the hairs.
Right.
And then in the Congress, they actually lost seats.
Right.
So is the national heartbeat actually going towards that of the left? I mean, in some regards, I could say probably in a cultural standpoint, we can feel it. But then you look at how people actually reacted across the board from an actual policy making standpoint, the actual lawmakers, and it wasn't as much of a resounding left wing triumph as it
Right.
was made out to be, especially immediately after the election.
I think my fear with that, and like, I understand what you're saying, my fear with that is now post January 6th and post all of that, I think we're dealing with a situation as well where let's say Republicans elected in 2024, will they be
Mhm.
allowed to govern? Will
Right.
they be allowed to have private sector involvement if a company doesn't want to be associated with what the left has made, untouchable or horrible or bad? So that's why I wonder about the direction of the GOP brand. And you brought up sort of your evolution away from the Republican side. Were there times during that 2016 primary, which I think absorbed the whole nation even more than Democrats, were there times where you felt like the GOP was super strong in that primary, or to you, was it the whole thing was just sort of a mess?
It was a mess, um, but more so because it kind of ended up being exactly what happened here in 2020. It wasn't anything, it wasn't the GOP running on principles against Hillary Clinton. It was we were running against Hillary Clinton. Vice
Right,
versa, it wasn't the Democrats this past election cycle running on principles against Donald Trump. It was the Democrats running against Donald Trump. And
right,
that's, I think, what we've gotten too much into, of this swinging back and forth of voting against the thing in power versus actually voting for what's going to be the best solution for the country. And we have to be able to empower people to make that decision on their own. And again, I know I keep on going back to it, but I mean, folks, your vote for school board, for city
right.
council, that has quite literally like 1,000 times in some cases more weight than your vote for president. Like, think about that. If you could make a real impact by just being more aware of what's happening in your community on non-traditional election years, you could make a really big difference.
Right. And
And if
then,
and yeah, and I didn't mean to drop it. Like, if you
yeah.
can't do that with voting, then move with your feet. Go to states that are actually supporting the things that we talk about. Support the states that are actually putting the policies that we talk about on a daily basis that are truly pro liberty, pro freedom.
And with a lot of those seats, I think Democrats would have a more difficult time mobilizing against libertarians as much because you don't have that built-in hatred for them. You don't associate them with Trump at the same level you do with Republicans. So in those seats that are closer, should there be some sort of talk between Republicans and Libertarians about Republicans trying to sit out certain elections for very local seats to try to get in more libertarians so you can have a bigger coalition and expand away from leftism and all of the things that's happening ideologically on the left?
I would be all about that. I've actually made the actual example was a Thomas Massey example. I'm not ever going to ask a libertarian to primary essentially Thomas Massey, who's like 90% my
Right,
ally, right? So
right,
let's take that on a micro scale that you were referring to. If you can get a libertarian candidate who is a well-known, let's take Bill again in my example. If Bill can be your candidate, the well-known, respected member in the community, and run as a libertarian, then yeah, have Bill be that candidate. Don't have to feel that you need to run as the big two party, but also know that you might be facing some institutionally put in place challenges. And we've
right,
discussed this: ballot access issues, even just a matter of trying to find the candidate on the actual ballot. They can
right.
put you at the very bottom in the weirdest
Yeah.
locations. There's so many things that they can get screwy with. So just know that there will be things that you will have challenges with. But if you have the ability to reach people beyond using the traditional political mouthpieces that are the GOP and Democratic Party, I think we actually have a really good chance to get some real, like, actual libertarian or conservatarian politicians, not just elected into office, but then more importantly, get things done.
And with the future 2022 primaries are coming up, that whole fundraising process is sort of kickstarted or will be in the next couple months.
It
And
never ends.
no, and a lot of what we're seeing is the MAGA candidates, the people who are running on that platform that with the Trump endorsement, threatening Republican candidates with primarying in more purple districts or slightly leading red districts. How do you think that's going to shake out? These people probably will get the nomination because there's so much Trump support in the primary process. Do you think that will help retake the House, or do you think it will just marginalize Republican access to the House even more?
Well, Magdalene, I hate to be the downer, but in the in the theme that we've identified so far, people don't really necessarily vote for things, right? They vote against
Right.
things. So I think what we're going to see is it's not the Republicans voting for Republicans or voting for Trump, but rather they're going to be voting against what's happening right now
Right.
in office. So you have Democratic controlled president, you have Democrat controlled Senate, essentially with Kamala Harris being the swing vote at 50-50, and you have a Democrat controlled House of Representatives. So we see, and this is pretty much throughout history, is that as you have the president switch over from one party to the other, and if they happen to also receive the House along the way, which they did in this case, that in that first 2 years, if they go wild and they start putting all these new crazy policies, be it left or right, into policy, into action, that the voters actually react in not a good way,
Right.
because people, believe it or not, don't like change. It was funny, like Obama's biggest slogan was hope and change, but then at the end of the day, people really
Sorry, one
don't like.
second. There's a
Oh,
wasp behind me.
oh,
One
you're
second.
good.
All right, I apologize for that. Everybody had a wasp situation. Everyone on the show knows I'm very, very afraid of bugs. So I'm going to ask a different question because
There's a murder hornet. Let's be real, Magdalene. There's a murder hornet. It was a big deal. She's safe though. We're good.
Thank you. I can't remember. We can't remember where we were. So the question that I'm going to ask now is, as somebody who has been studying libertarian and Republican politics, I have wondered, is there a libertarian establishment within the Libertarian Party? Because
Absolutely.
we never really hear about that. I've interviewed some libertarian politicians. They never talk about it. So does it exist? And if it does, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Where does it fall?
You'll hear this term used quite a bit, the Beltway Libertarians. And
Oh.
basically that refers to folks who are in the DC Beltway, right? That 95 corridor. So when you're talking about a Beltway libertarian, and it essentially is the establishment, right? It's the people who you would say they like to get invited to the parties. They like to touch elbows at the very fancy dinners and the balls and the galas. They like that. They like to be able to have the access, and that's fine. There's a role for that, but that it's definitely the gatekeeper, if you will, in terms of a policy perspective, from a respect, I guess, standpoint, from the current political establishment, the elites. Then there's the other libertarians out there, the more grassroots, and I would say you'd see this, out there, the Mises Caucus, the Radical Caucus. You go on down the rabbit hole, and then there's folks out there who just are more like they're politically libertarian, but they don't really identify into one particular camp. They tend to be more of that like grassroots libertarian, but no, the Beltway libertarian, it is a real thing.
And does it help? Does it hurt? Because I know we have Beltway Republicans, but I just sort of assume all Republicans are sort of Beltway Republicans. So what do the Beltway Libertarians do that is damaging or do that is helpful within the whole election process for libertarians?
Well, just like everything in life, there's a pro and a con. So the cons, I would say, is from a messaging standpoint. Sometimes our Beltway libertarian gatekeepers and mouthpieces forget that the people that they talk to in DC, they're not real people. They're and I'm tongue in cheek, but I mean the lizard people in DC, they're not your average mom and dad who are out there trying to raise a family. They're not your average small business owner trying to make the books work, but rather they kind of get stuck in this world of this is the real life. So from a messaging standpoint, not too hot. But where they do actually have a lot of success, and where there's a very big pro for this Beltway libertarian, is getting actual policy changes implemented. So being able to navigate the legal waters, be able to navigate the policy waters, utilizing think tanks, utilizing lawmakers, utilizing all those tools that traditionally the major two parties and those politicians in those two parties can leverage. We do have those resources as well. And candidly, they wouldn't be there without the funding that we get from a lot of our donors for that. So it's important to know that there is a role for the Beltway Libertarian, but just like the grassroots, I think that's part of the strength, but also the weakness. While you're able to have the funding, you're able to have that mouthpiece, sometimes they forget, well, what's the mouthpiece actually used for? Who are we talking to? How are we supposed to articulate the message? Are we talking to people who are going to be paying our bills, or people who are actually voting the people that we need to get into office to get this policy done? It's a very fine line, but the answer is both. We need to do both. And I think That's why we've seen this big schism in the LP, especially over the past 4 years, is
Right.
because this has been, this has been coming down the road for the past 30, 40 years. But this conversation now where we've gotten to the LP, this Beltway versus, we'll say the grassroots libertarian, what's the answer going to be? And we're starting to see it's now we're seeing this Mises caucus conversation, and that's happening more and more. But also you see that there's traditionally, Justin Amash going from Republican to libertarian, and I would say, he's I guess a Beltway libertarian, but in a good way. I mean, I like Justin.
Right.
Justin's a friend of my the show, and I think he's easily, if you were to look at him, probably one of the best Congress people we've ever had ever. I
Yeah.
mean, hands down.
Yeah.
And there's a role for somebody like Justin, and that's something I think that we need to be able to appreciate as well. So I think, again, it's a fine line. Life's about balance. You can have the cake, but you just can't have too much cake.
And with people like Justin Amash and Thomas Massey, I know that during the Trump presidency, there was a very big targeting of people who were not towing the line that Trump saw within Congress. And it was very frustrating, especially in the case of Thomas Massey, because he didn't change in his lineup. Like, nothing
Right.
changed. He didn't get less consistent. He didn't become a libertarian. Everything was pretty much the same, and this upset Trump very much. So these Republicans that face that, do you see them making the jump, even aside from the two we've mentioned, into the libertarian sphere because they feel that there's too much of a cult of personality in the GOP right now, and it seems going forward?
Well, I think it would depend entirely on what those individuals' goals would be. So
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Massey understands that he can play the best role he can do in the GOP,
Right.
because he knows that he's going to get reelected in Kentucky as a Republican, and he can do that as a Republican who, oh, by the way, happens to be like a 99% libertarian at his heart, right?
Right.
So he can play that game. It's politics, and that's okay, because now he's in a position to make policy changes, to actually impact law. But to the contrary, there is a role for libertarians out there as well. I'd say the role right now the Libertarian Party plays the most is playing the alternative voice,
Right.
but to the point of knowing that we can cause pain and we can be that spoiler. So if you're a
Right.
Republican and you're in a very pro-gun area, but you're a squishy person on guns, and there's a group of people who are like, well, I'm going to vote for the pro 2A libertarian. Well, yeah, you might lose 3% of your vote for that. Well, guess what? Run better candidates. And that actually pushes
Right.
the candidates both on the right, but also on the left. If you have a candidate who's running as, a progressive Democrat, but they're, a pro cop union, public cop union Democrat, then if I'm a libertarian, I'm running as hard as I can to the left, saying, why are you supporting someone who's just going to go ahead and increase the criminal justice system to the point that they're going to be putting more, non-violent criminals, if we can use the word criminals, in jail? That's completely corrupt. You can't even pretend to be a progressive. So there's a gentleman named Scott Horton. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Scott Horton, but he has a great saying, and it's, when you're talking about these issues, you're talking about politics to the left or the right, you approach politics and sell this from the left, and to the right, from the right. And if we're able to remember that that's how we have to approach things, I think we're going to have a lot more success in actually getting people to come to the center, right, as libertarians. Because if our goal is to actually get policy changes, until we can start winning elections, the role is to guide the other two parties. And I think it's easier, I guess, to say, but I think we're starting to see some policy changes. We saw Republicans being pro criminal justice reform, which is cool. They were at least echoing non-foreign war intervention, which is cool. On the left, we're seeing some conversations about helping focus on criminal, ending the war on drugs, but also criminal justice reform. I think we're starting to see some folks wake up on the left from like a culture standpoint, like some saying like maybe we shouldn't be having folks, having their free speech decided by a government organization like they're doing over in the United Kingdom. Like, that's a little authoritarian and sketchy. Like Jake Tapper on CNN's like, hold up, what? This is kind of crazy. When Jake Tapper is saying it's kind of crazy, yeah, it's time to like maybe raise a red flag there, my folks on the left. So I think there's a role in both respects. But it's just, you have to be tactical. We can't just be, and I say it's my friend on the libertarian side. I'm like, we just can't, be the bull in a china shop. It doesn't work.
Right.
So, or the John Mulaney, the horse in the hospital. It can't be the horse in the hospital. That worked once because it was Trump. And
Right.
people are aware now that the horse can get in the hospital. So
Right. And I think that's an important point because there are so many candidates who think they can just run a Trump campaign.
yep,
And it's one thing to have only rallies when you were the leader of the free world. People come
right.
to your rallies. And it's fine to campaign like that, but it's not really feasible when you're a Senate candidate or you're a House candidate. It doesn't really work the same way. And I've had a couple libertarians on. Some I would classify more as right-leaning or left-leaning libertarians. This time the libertarian ticket for the presidency took a bit more of a left turn than last time.
Mm-hmm.
What was the decision behind that? Because in 2016 it seemed like the libertarian ticket was more of a conservative leaning, and this time it was definitely more left leaning.
So help me here. So when you say left leaning, what are you thinking?
It seemed to be more aligned with activists on the left. There seemed to be more a conversation about social issues, about having that, whereas you had more things on the economy, you had more things on foreign policy in that time. So there seemed to be sort of a divergence on what people were paying attention to that time.
Fascinating. It's so interesting because a lot of folks from 2016 did not like the messaging from Gary
That's
and
what I've
Nichol.
heard. Yeah.
And particularly because Gary, I'll say right here, Gary saying that a libertarian is someone who's socially conservative and fiscally liberal. I'm sorry, fiscally liberal and socially conservative. No, I'm sorry. What do you say? Socially liberal and fiscally conservative. There we go. And I was like, no,
Right.
Gary, that's not what it means to be a libertarian. Like, and that was part of the problem, is that Gary didn't know how to articulate libertarian ideas. I mean, he was a Republican governor, but that doesn't really mean too much. But he ran as a good Republican, pro-liberty governor, which is great. Bill Weld, I have issues with him too, but his are more personal just because he's kind of an icky person. But then number one, so both Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen, great people, had them both on the show. Spike, love him to death.
Great, yeah.
Love Spike to death. Doing a lot of work with Spike as well. And I would say for Joe, it wasn't so much, and I think maybe it's sometimes we confuse strategy and principles with what is on people's minds, if that makes sense. So let's say, for example, that I were to start talking to you, Magdalene, right now. We're in March, and I'm assuming it's a little bit warmer where you are right now.
Yeah.
If I came over to you and I said, here you go, I have the biggest, warmest, fluffiest jacket. It will keep you warm in temperatures up to negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You want to buy it right now? And you're going to be like, not now? Like, right. Thanks. Why? Because March. It's going to be warm. Like, I don't need a nice big warm jacket right now. So maybe as we're getting like November and I entered that conversation, now it's like, oh, maybe you might want to buy that jacket, right? So what was the conversation during the election cycle, right? Boom. And I mean, right now, the criminal justice reform, you saw from George Floyd, really, that was the precipice all the way through the summer. But also the lockdowns and trust me, we have had a lot of libertarians rightfully argue that the lockdowns were not discussed enough and they should have been the number one issue. But it's important to know that we have to sometimes talk about things that are on the national discourse from a principled standpoint. And that did ruffle some feathers, but at the same point in time, it is important for us to enter those conversations and making sure that we are making the articulate libertarian, in this case, position from a principled standpoint. And that is, no, we shouldn't have one monopoly on violence. Why? Why should the government have a monopoly on violence? And that's, monopolies are bad, right? So like, if we can argue that, then I think that's a winning argument. But I don't like to argue with people. I like to try to build solutions. So I say, let's focus on getting rid of that monopoly. How can we do that, right? And I think that's where we're having more success in that conversation versus if we just weren't entering the conversation at all.
Yeah. And I think that that's an important point because it's difficult for Republican voters always to access that any other party aside from Democrats has two sides, that there is some back and forth and that it's not always the GOP that's suffering. I wanted to ask you, just sort of in closing, What is your advice to local GOP chapters going forward on how they can try to build out coalitions with independent voters and libertarian voters, or even people who are just disaffected from politics who are not currently engaged voters? Because I don't believe that the GOP is on the path, aside from what you said before about wanting a different party in charge if another party is the White House. I don't think they're on the path to victory aside from that.
I'll answer your question with a question. So what would happen if one company only went to one city forever and ever, and they only went to that one place? Would their business really grow too much? No, probably not, right? So what we need to do is we need to stop focusing on the one location, right? We need to start going out and beyond our current, in this case, echo chambers. Go to the places that you wouldn't normally go. Go to the pro union meeting. Go to the pro environmental change meeting, or climate, pro Green New Deal meeting. Go there, and then when you're there, and to paraphrase my good buddy Spike Cohen, ask some questions, and then when you get some answers, ask some more questions.
Right.
Because what you're going to find is that the average person, they probably have the same goal that you do, and we just often have very different solutions. But I think you're going to find, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as we start to have these conversations with people, and we start to uncover common ground on understanding that we both want to see things get better, and then objectively start to look back to find where we can make those things actually come to fruition, I think we're going to find that we're going to have more success doing that. I think you're going to see the local chapters have more success growing their members, because now we're expanding the outreach. We're no longer focusing on these little collective bubbles of people we already talk to, who already speak our language.
Right.
I've never known a good company who only focuses on one thing and only focuses that one thing entirely. They're not going to really grow too much. So that's where we're going to get better. But it requires us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to get out of our comfort zones. You have to talk with people who, quite frankly, probably don't agree with you, but enter into the conversation, not into, as we discussed when you were on my program, not to go into a debate, but rather to go in trying to uncover a problem that you can both identify, and then try to find some solutions. And if we can present the libertarian, conservatarian, whatever you want to be, solutions as the most logical, rational solutions based on helping them see the emotional appeal to the problem in their life that's going to solve, I think, Madeline, that's going to be the key to success. And it starts with us doing it local. So I encourage people to reach out to people, go to those Facebook groups for the folks on the left that you would never talk to in a million years, and just start to ask questions, get involved, and go talk to people in real life too. Face-to-face stuff. I know it's now becoming okay to, I guess, talk to people again, because COVID's decided that, I guess, it doesn't like us anymore, so it's going away. So it's good to see people face to face. That's going to be really helpful as we can do that. So go to those different organizations, different events, and get present, get involved.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, especially because if we had Republicans going to, climate change meetings or going to social justice activist gatherings, just what we would learn from what they want or their strategies alone would be definitely invaluable. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you on social media to keep up with your work and your show?
Absolutely. So I made it really easy for folks. They can just search my name. It's Brian Nichols, and my show is The Brian Nichols Show. My website is briannicholsshow.com, and you can find me on all social media, and that's Twitter, Facebook, minds.com, and parlor.com at B Nichols Liberty, BNICHOLS Liberty, Magdalene Rose. It was a blast. Thank you so much for having me on.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll link all that below.